Hi, I'm Clare of Argyll Archaeology. I'm going to talk about our community-led excavation at a Norse and medieval site called Lephin, which is located on the Isle of Mull. So the work was carried out by myself and Mull Museum. So Lephin is located at the north end of Mull, next to Glengorm Castle and coffee shop. So why were we excavating at Lephin? Well, back in 2012, we carried out a community-led excavation at the site of Baliscate. Now, Baliscate had previously been evaluated by the Time team, who concluded that it was an early Christian cemetery and chapel site, which was associated with an outside altar or lecht. As part of our works at the excavation of Baliscate, we also surveyed a number of other sites with similar plans as that Baliscate, also located on the Isle of Mull. And you can see here in grey Lephin, and you can see actually the sort of superficial similarities of this site to that Baliscate. So what did we find at Baliscate? Well, we had the early Christian cemetery dating to the 7th to 8th century. And then this was overlain by a turf and stone structure dating to the 13th and 14th centuries. What we didn't get at Baliscate was direct evidence that the later 13th and 14th century structure and enclosure were of a religious nature. So we had no associated burials. And a lot of the archaeological evidence from those structures seemed to indicate that it might actually be a farm or domestic dwelling as opposed to a chapel. But we couldn't make any firm conclusions. So subsequently, we decided to excavate at Lephin in order that we may sort of get a clearer idea of what these structures were actually used for. So this is Lephin. You can see that on the left-hand side. You can see on the Google image, you can see the enclosure and the central main structure. And Lephin Township is located to the right of the slide. So this is the image of our excavations during the first season, and you can see outlined in the dotted blue line the main structure, the enclosures outlined in the red line, and then the coarse blue line is a later structure overlying the enclosure. So we're going to look at the earliest features first, and they were found in Trench 4. In this trench we had a large pit, 212, which we interpret as a large pit hearth, and we had clear evidence of in situ burning in this. This was associated with a couple of other pits, but then very few other little other features. You can see on the right hand side of the photographs the later enclosure wall. So we had lots of material that we recovered from this hearth. This included what Gemma at the National Museum of Scotland interpreted as a bone comb and bone comb case. We think this is made from antler, and you can see in the top right hand corner there we've got actual antler tines. So it's clear that they were working antler on the site. We also got what Gemma calls a craft knife, so a metal knife that we recovered from the hearth ashes too. Also recovered from the hearth ash was this Norse period pottery and a typical Norse whetstone. Apologies for the quality of the photos. We've not managed to get the finds photographed yet just because of COVID, etc. Also from the hearth, we got carbonised cereal grains, including oats and barley, hazelnut shell and flaxseed. So we also got from Trench 6, it's down here, we also got a feature that looks like a bedding trench for a possible organic wall, a fence like. Charcoal, again from this fill, dates it to the Norse period, possibly about 100 years later than that hearth we had. So the working hypothesis at the moment is that this is a Norse period farm, presumably the structure made mostly out of turf, surrounded by a timber fence. We had another possible structure of an early sort of Norse period as well in Trench 7. So here you can see post hole 2013. This is associated with what appears to be stone paving. What we retrieved from the bottom of the post hole was a layer of pure charcoal, which dates to the same period as our Norse hearth. And I'm wondering whether this is a post hole and paving either within or at the entrance of yet another Norse structure. So this is something that we want to return to Lephin and explore further. We also got evidence of earlier structures underneath the main structure. So this slide shows a plan of the main structure, and here we have 3 post holes, so that's 513, 526 and 524, and also a bit of a gully, 522. We only excavated a small portion of this, that actually we found under all the floor levels of the main structure. We've not radiocarbon dated these because the fills are very clean, but I think again these are going to be Norse period. Norse period structures are quite rare or unknown really in Argyll, apart from we had one at Baliscate. We had a Norse period kiln surrounded by a stone and turf structure that had a very typical plan. Out in the Western Isles, Norse structures are often very like this in plan. So they're not unknown in Argyll, and I'm sure they're out there. They just need discovering and recognising. So now I'm going to move on to discuss the main structure outlined here. This is the plan and photographs of our first season of excavation, where we concentrated the trench over the entrance of the main structure and over the enclosure wall. You can see here that the main structure has a turf and stone footing and a tapered entrance. This was later blocked up. Within the interior of the main structure are a couple of post holes. You can see those here. And so our conclusions was that there was a timber frame within the building that supported the weight of the roof, with turf and stone walls on the outside. This is a plan of our second season of excavation in the main structure, where basically we took out the east end of the structure. This image shows the nature of the dirty floors, and the little white markers show the location of all our finds, including pottery and lots of iron objects. Now, what you can see in this photograph and also in plan is that the walls appear to be of 2 different types. So we've got large stones, orthostats, lining the turf and stone walls, but at the east end and the part of the north wall, you can see we've got coursed stone. And I think what we have here are 2 phases of building or rebuilding. So we've got the original structure that was built from turf and stone, and the interior walls were lined with orthostats. And then we've got a later rebuild where the stone is built in a much more traditional or more modern manner. And we've got dates for the earliest dates from the floors of this main structure, dated to the mid-12th to mid-13th century, whereas the rebuild seems to have happened in the late 14th to early 15th century. We had a Robert III silver grout from the Edinburgh Mint, and that was dates between 1390 and 1400. And we recovered that from one of the later floor levels. This again shows the interior of the main structure, but after we have excavated most of the floor levels. And you can just see quite clearly here the 2 different types of building methods used. And again, this is just a close-up showing that building method. And this is an image of Baliscate, where you can see we've basically got the same period structure and the same method of construction. This image shows the post holes of pre-main structure build. So these are probably Norse period post holes and a gully. And then this was covered by the main structure, and these are the post holes that presumably went all the way around the interior of the structure, and they would have supported the roof structure. We do have evidence, certainly from the later phase, that the roof was probably slated. We've got lots of decorated pot. We had over 312 sherds of pot from the site, and this is an example of a handle with sort of a dotty motif on it. We had a probable jug, spouted jug in the centre, and then some more dotted pot. This kind of decorated pot from the 12th to 14th century has also been found on Lismore and also Iona. So there seems to be a tradition in the 12th to 14th century of this kind of decoration in Argyll on the pottery. So we're now going to look at a slightly later structure that we discovered within the enclosure. This is in Trench 7. This structure is located at the north side of the trench. It had a turf wall and was slightly sunken in the interior. There was a hearth at one end with peat, ash, and analysis of that showed that it was basically peat being burnt with lots of heather. And we had a radiocarbon date from that, from the mid 15th to early 16th century. Interestingly, this was infilled by a red silk full of large fragments of oak charcoal and quite a lot of slag material. And Gemma, who did the analysis, thinks that this is evidence of a nearby metalworking furnace. And some of the metalworking indicates that there was some specialised metalworking going on at this period too. Then the latest feature we have on site is a possible barn, which we did a small trench over in Trench 3. Here you can see it in plan and photograph, and we just dug this trench just to prove that actually this structure did overlie the collapsed stone structure of the enclosure, and indeed it does. We've also got from Lephin a mysterious burial, and you can see this on the slide in the bottom left-hand corner of the plan, where we've got a burial located just under the rubble and cut into the very late upper floor levels of the main structure. And you can see we've got a really late date for this. We took a small sample of the bone and the tooth, and this person, whoever they were, had a mainly terrestrial diet. We have a theory that it may be Ian Balvain of Killimore, who's a McKinnon, who was killed by an arrow in 1642. At that time they'd moved, at that point they were based in Skye, but he was apparently buried back on Mull at Dunara Castle, which is just located just to the west of Glengorm Castle. And I think it's probably unlikely that actually this is that burial, because there's no reason why he wouldn't actually be buried within the castle itself or the dune itself. Interestingly, Lephin is shown on the first edition map as a burial ground, even though it wasn't known as a burial ground or consecrated site in any record. So it looks like that this fairly recent burial certainly was remembered or known of by the people who talked to the surveyors, the first edition ordnance surveyors, and hence it was recorded as a burial ground. So this is just an image showing my amazement of volunteers and their obvious enjoyment and persistence despite Argyll weather. Obviously without all the volunteers we'd never get any of this work done, so hats off to them. So to conclude, in the mid 11th to mid 12th century, what we appear to have at Lephin is a Viking structure, probably built of turf, which had a big, large central hearth, and within the structure they were working antler and bone in a typical Norse style. So it was probably the location of a Norse farm where they were growing oats and barley and flax, as well as working metals. And within the enclosure at Lephin, we've got hints of other early Norse structures as well. By the mid-12th to mid-13th century, the Norse farm is then replaced by a substantial rectangular stone and turf structure, and the building method that we see at Baliscate. And again, the occupants were consuming mixed cereals and exploiting wild foods. And then 100 years later, the farmhouse was partially rebuilt, and I think maybe at this time it was enclosed by this substantial stone wall. Again, oats were the main crop. Pottery is still hand built, but it seems to share a sort of stylistic characteristic with other pottery in Argyll. And it would seem that the persons living here maybe were the local elite, because they obviously had access to coinage, and we also got a fragment of an annular brooch. By the mid-15th century, the main structure was abandoned, and we've got a turf structure built with the enclosure, and then probably the area used to make metal and metalworking. And then finally, once all that was collapsed and nearly abandoned, a barn was built over the collapsed enclosure wall. So clearly what we've got here is for all intents and purposes, a Norse farm that then becomes a medieval farm. There seems to be no indication that the site was ever an early Christian chapel, enclosed chapel site. But we do strangely have a burial of a very late period in it, and that requires further investigation to find out what the story surrounding this burial. So what next? Well, what we want to do is go back to Lephin and actually determine whether there is another Norse period structure on the east side of the enclosure, and also try and determine whether the Norse farm was actually enclosed by a wooden fence. And also near to Lephin are a couple of mounds which Peter Leach, is a retired archaeologist on the island, thinks may be a Viking ship burial, so we'd like to go and evaluate those and to see if they are. And then another exciting project, but a larger project, perhaps for well, certainly for a later date, and a good requirement for lots of funding, would be that just to the west of Glengorm Castle, James Petrie has identified what he thinks may be a Viking harbour. So you can see that in the images here. So this is the location of possible Viking harbour, and here it is in detail. Just here is Dunarris Castle, and then this is Lephin here. So one project would be if we could do some excavation in this area. There's clearly longhouse structures all around here, clearly medieval material within inside this dune, which may or may not be earlier in date. And it would be nice to be able to see whether this is actually, any of this can be dated to the Norse period, which would obviously give ammunition to James's theory that this may be a Viking harbour. And I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you very much to all our funders in Season 1 and Season 2. Thank you.